Hi again, everybody. We'll be having a nice, relaxing lunch, so hang in there. This next panel is one that I really, when we were organizing it, I really wanted to. I was really looking forward to this, and the name of the panel is "Looking Forward: Advances in Medical and Social Science, the Most Promising New Approaches to Juvenile Justice Reform Over the Past Decade, and Those on the Horizon in Biomedicine, Social Science, Social Psychology, and Child Development Research." Chairing, or I should say, leading this discussion, as well as presenting in this discussion, is Stephen Phillippi, who is the chair of Behavioral and Community Health Sciences at the Louisiana State University School of Public Health. Dr. Phillippi is also the director of the Institute for Public Health and Justice, working to bring evidence-based practices and supportive policies to states and local communities. Our other two panelists are equally as distinguished, and they will introduce themselves as they present. Dr. Phillippi.
Good morning.
Morning.
Thanks for having us. First of all, I'm glad you're excited about the topic. Just to make sure we all understood the rules, we have 10 minutes to cover like a ton of information. So we're going to drop big pieces of information and leave a whole lot of time for y'all's questions. That's the goal here. And we're going to, as we go, let Carly and Craig introduce themselves as well. So thanks for having us, and I really appreciate being here. So a couple of things. One is I loved where Marcia had started off with the lower age of criminal responsibility, and just to remind you how critical those areas are, and I know y'all like the human standpoint of a lot of these stories. So literally within the last 2 weeks, I've been working on drug treatment standards for our courts in Louisiana, and especially around juvenile drug courts, which in the brief nutshell, we've been doing juvenile drug courts now for almost over 2 decades. The research on juvenile drug courts is not good. It's about half, maybe it works, and half, no, it didn't work. And we still use them. But I've been working with the state to really increase our standards around what works, what do we know in juvenile substance abuse treatment, to make sure that the kids get the best access to care. I say that all in the backdrop of the human side of that, which is in the last 2 weeks, I literally had a phone call that said, by the way, I've got a 9-year-old that was kicked out of school because he had his older brother's marijuana on campus, and by school policy and rule, he can't go back to school for 2 years unless he's in treatment. So we want to put him in juvenile drug court. That's the best answer we have in 2018, is to put a 9-year-old in juvenile drug court to allow him to get back into school. We've got problems still. Needless to say, we're looking at other options. The other thing that I think is very key to this whole discussion, a lot of people have mentioned the silos, including Kim, breaking down the silos between juvenile justice and child welfare. I'd say even more siloed than that is making sure that we keep key players at the table. Law enforcement at the table, judges at the table, our district attorneys at the table. They play a key role in all this. For example, y'all have heard a little bit about the developmental research and how important it is that we are looking at kids and looking at their immaturity and their impulsivity and their risk-taking and taking into the fact all of that. And one of the things that kept me in check about a year ago, I do a lot of training with law enforcement. And I still remember the reaction of one of the law enforcement officers as we were building a training for law enforcement about how do you take all these things into consideration so you can make arrest an absolute last resort. And when they heard all the findings of the developmental research, impulsivity, risk-taking, they said, oh my God, we should arrest earlier, faster, quicker, and or be able to draw our weapons faster. And at first I giggled a little bit. I'm like, no, you're joking, right? But if you hear it from a law enforcement perspective, a high impulsive risk-taking kid suddenly becomes a bigger danger. So we've done a lot of work. We've actually, one of my favorite things I've been able to do over the last 5 to 6 years is we've developed curriculum for law enforcement, keeping them at the table, training them on adolescent development, reminding them, my favorite exercise that we do with them is we remind them about their own adolescence. And you'd be amazed at how many cops stole cars when they were teenagers and drove really fast, usually including alcohol. And they admit to all this in our training, and it's a good reminder of how dumb they were as teenagers, like we all were. Well, not all of us. Maybe not some of y'all, but so that kind of thing. Also, the impact, we know the prevalence. I'm still amazed at how recent the history is. Just really quickly, I know that we've talked a lot about history in the last several sessions here, but I just want to remind you, I mean, in 2000, it was right at the turn of the century, we started the Girls Study Group federally, like realizing that girls were different than boys in the juvenile justice system. This is only the last 2 decades. We just started looking at race, really? I mean, those of us that have been working in juvenile justice, this has been an obvious situation for a long time, and we're just looking at it. LGBT youth, they might be different than the other kids and being treated different than the other kids in this system. We're just starting to look at it, so we have so much ahead of us, and that makes me excited. All of that being said, the big issues, and I promised I would drop big issues. So one is, I've got to give credit where credit's due. The Affordable Care Act, the unbelievable impact it has had on allowing, especially in states like Louisiana, where I'm from, where we've been able to do expansion, access. We have almost 80% of our kids under the age of 18 now have access to care. Now, there's issues there. There's three legs to that stool that are critical. Access is only one. Timely access. If you have access but you can't get it when you need it, doesn't make much sense. And then the most critical one is where we still have a lot of work to do, and a lot of people have mentioned evidence-based practices, but if you have timely access to really bad practice, that doesn't help either. So you have to have access, you have to have timeless, and you also have to have quality care on the other end of that. So we are focusing and spending a lot of time on how do we get evidence-based practices to youth and their families. And we know a lot more than we have ever known about evidence-based practices, and I'm happy to certainly discuss that further. Louisiana, for what it's worth, we at the School of Public Health, we wear buttons often that say 50 no more. And the reason for that is if you look at the state rankings, we are 50 often. I was glad to hear the reporter from Jackson. Mississippi and Louisiana usually battle out for who's going to be in last place. And we're on a mission to be 50 no more. One of the things that we have been far above 50, though, on is juvenile justice reform. I started working with the courts almost 25 years ago. Did probation work, did social work, and where we have come, my caseload back then was like anywhere from 80 to 110 kids and families on my caseload. I don't even know what you do with that. I know what I do with it. I chased and put out fires. The caseload for probation officers today is hovering around 25, 30, much more realistic, much more engaged. We've also been able to, we were the incarceration capital of the world for juveniles. The ACA actually printed an edition right at the turn of the century with a picture of those of y'all that may remember a lot of the lawsuits in Louisiana. It was a picture of Tallulah, and it was the most progressive, quote, correctional facility from a correction standpoint, like security, and there wasn't a whole lot of programming and things like that. But we've literally gone from almost 5,000 kids, and that's big in Louisiana. That's a huge per capita count, to literally, we're sitting around 250, 260 kids that are incarcerated today. We've gotten kids back in the community. And one of the ways we've done it is by increasing the access to evidence-based practices, things like multi-systemic therapy, functional family therapy, and being able to show, as y'all have mentioned over and over again this morning, arrest rates continue to go down. So we don't have kids that are incarcerated. We have kids accessing evidence-based practices, and public safety continues to improve. So these are all good things. These are all good signs about where we should be and where we could go. So a couple of other just big bucket issues and with a lot less description. Affordable Care Act. This is the first time in decades that we actually see a max out of our psychiatry department at the School of Medicine in terms of the number of students interested, the number of students gaining residencies and all that. Psychiatry has been on a shortage for decades. Why? Partially because you weren't considered a real doctor. You didn't even get paid the same as your peers with your MD if you were doing psychiatry work because the parity laws didn't exist then. Payment has improved, and so has the interest in going in, and especially for women. A lot of the women in the med school have chosen psychiatry because it is a great place, as they report, for thinking about families. It's still more or less a 9-to-5 medical job. Why is that important? We've shifted a whole lot of psychopharm to pediatric doctors that weren't ever trained extensively in psychopharm. We've shifted it to physician's assistants and things like that. So having really qualified people distributing our psychopharmacology when you know the prevalence of mental health issues that are impacting our juvenile justice system is important. The other gift is, as long as we're on psychopharm, I'll just tell you, is it's coming, and it's going to be coming quick, and I'm excited about it. I don't know if any of y'all have to take medicine every day. I turned 50 this year, and I've got the cholesterol, the high blood pressure, all that stuff. I miss my medicine regularly. And we hand out psychopharmacology drugs to adolescents and their families, and we expect that they take it every day to help them function through schools, through their environments, sometimes twice a day. It's a tall order, and some of these, if you don't take them that day, you're going to see that day a huge shift in these kids. And one of the things that that is about to come out are long-acting psychopharmacology medicines. So you won't have to take them every day. Literally, you'll be able to get a shot. You'll be able to take something that will last 3 months, 2 months, 3 months, and you don't have to have that teenage brain working against you in terms of how much you can forget on your way out to the door to school. Other things in terms of big bucket items. Emergency departments. I'm glad y'all are asking about arrest data, and arrest data are certainly getting better, unless you ask about school shootings, and we all know that. Those of y'all that follow NPR certainly did a fantastic story about how bad we are reporting school shootings at this point, and there's a whole lot of reaction. The anomaly that happened in the 1990s that kicked off the super predator, we're about to have the same thing in schools, and there are more law enforcement going into schools, and these law enforcement officers are not heavily trained to be in schools, and I expect the impact will not be good unless we do more training with those officers. And then if you compare that to the number of mental health people that are being also sent to those schools, you've got very few mental health and a whole lot of law enforcement. So other sources of data that are important, school data. We're doing a national study with the National Center for Mental Health and Juvenile Justice on school safety right now, just to look at the impact of training officers, school policies, and we're doing it with 16 schools in Michigan and Louisiana. And hopefully in the next 6 months, 7 months, we'll see a lot of those data coming out. Other sources of data are important. Emergency departments actually have more credible data on a lot of things like violence, shootings, the actual cost of a lot of these shootings, especially when, thank God, people make it and survive, but they're maimed for life. And there's a whole cost to that, to our society, that we haven't paid a lot of attention to, including when kids are shot. And then they're going to live with this for the rest of their life with whatever the outcomes and issues were. I mentioned Medicaid expansion. I will say there's also issues. So with Medicaid expansion, fantastic. What we didn't do is correct how Medicaid is billed. So we still are operating under an accounting system where how many times can I touch that kid? I get money, and that's how I keep my doors open to do the work that I'm hoping to do as a mental health provider. Evidence-based practices don't work that way. You actually go in intense, short term, get them in, get them out. And what providers are struggling with is business models that keep their door open under the guise of Medicaid. Because if I can't keep that kid under my care, I'm going to start losing money very quickly. And just to emphasize that with a real human story, a woman talked to in North Louisiana when we brought some evidence-based practices up there. She had been in with her kids for a decade, getting care under Medicaid. And when the agency greeted her and said, hey, we've got a new program, we'd like you to go. She's like, I've been through all this stuff. I've been through Medicaid, been through all this stuff. And she was very reluctant. Entered a program, functional family therapy. She literally came back to that agency and said, oh my God, this is what treatment is like? Shocked. Like, I don't know what she's been getting for the last decade, but shocked over the quality that she could get, quality of care. But that is not the standard that a lot of providers are held to. So we have a lot of work to do to really disseminate evidence-based practices with fidelity, as was discussed earlier. And then I'll just say, certainly public health. That's why I'm in public health, growing things to scale. We have lots of issues with dissemination. So all those programs that I could mention, you could look up on websites. How do we get those out to the public? We don't do a very good job. Pharmaceutical company finds a drug that works today. They can get it out to the population within about 9 to 10 years and reach a critical mass of the population. In behavioral sciences, we don't do it well. It takes about 30 years to reach about 15 to 18% of the population that needs that intervention, that behavioral intervention. That's a long wait. So we've got a lot to learn in behavioral sciences and a lot of work to do to get things that we know are more effective out to the populations that need them. And with that, I will hush. Carly?
Thank you. Thank you. Hello, everybody. I'm Carly Dierkhising. I'm from Cal State LA. I'm a developmental psychologist masquerading as a criminal justice professor. So I'm pretty interdisciplinary. I actually was planning on speaking a bit more about sentencing, but I think that we have already heard from some of the experts in the room about that. So I do still want to touch a little bit on kind of focusing more on the developmental science piece of it, and then I also want to talk a little bit about trauma. But in listening and in understanding the Supreme Court cases that have really transformed how we think about youth and how we sentence youth, I think it's been really the most important thing that has happened in the last few decades for juvenile justice, because it's also trickled down to the local level in a variety of ways, and you heard about some of those examples in California. But the Supreme Court, they really base their decisions in taking into account developmental science, as well as neuroscience and social sciences, really a broad range of sciences. And I think I just want to take a minute to, what does it mean when we talk about developmental immaturity, right? So there are 3 hallmarks that are kind of highlighted when we talk about that related to these cases. And that being impulsivity, we heard about that, and risk-taking, right? So what does that mean? So our youth, earlier in development, they are less likely to, when they think about the future consequences, if they're even thinking about future consequences at all, they're more likely to see a benefit. When they do that risk-benefit ratio, they're more likely to see a benefit from engaging in that risk-taking behavior. As adults, we tend to weigh the risk more heavily as compared to the youth. And the second hallmark is that susceptibility to the peer pressure. So a lot of delinquent behavior is done in groups. And actually a lot of our youth that were transferred into the adult system and sentenced to life without had committed their crime with a group, and most likely with a group of older adults, so people that were much older than them. So they're more susceptible to that peer influence. And then third is that this immaturity is actually transient. So what does that mean? That means that there is an ability to rehabilitate. So they are much more malleable than unfortunately we are. They're still understanding who they are. They're still developing their identity, their sense of self, and they have that increased ability to rehabilitate. And that is another thing that the Supreme Court took into account. But one of the things that I always caution people about when we talk about developmental immaturity is that doesn't mean that adolescents are dumb or that they're bad at making decisions, because I think that can sometimes be the message that comes across. really, it just means that they're still developing these skills that adults are better at, right? But also, sometimes it's important to think about the circumstances that they're in, right? So one of the ways that I like to describe it is hot cognition versus cold cognition. So what do we mean by that? So why is it that in California, for instance, a 16-year-old is able to decide whether or not they're going to get an abortion without parental consent? They can do that on their own. However, a 16-year-old can get their license, but they can't go and drive with whoever they want, whenever they want, right? I was able to. I just beat that change in law when I was younger. I was very happy about that then. But you have to be with an older adult. You can't have a bunch of other teenagers in the car when you're a new driver. And why is that? Because we've learned that that's when they get into accidents, and that's when a lot of our youth were dying, right? So we knew from the data, and so they changed the laws. So what's the difference between these situations? And that's that hot cognition versus cold cognition. And deciding whether or not a youth is going to get an abortion, they have an older adult with them helping them, even if it might not be their parent, but they have that doctor there. There's oftentimes a waiting period, too, between when you first consult with a doctor and then when you are able to actually make that decision, or when you go through with the procedure, if you do. So there is time for a youth to think about their decision. It doesn't have to be on the spot, in the moment, and there's not necessarily pressure from their, people their age, unless they're, of course, talking with some of those folks, maybe. It's very different when we look at when youth are getting involved in crime. It's often in the moment, on the spot, in those instances of that hot cognition, and that's when they struggle with making those more appropriate decisions. So it's not necessarily that they're bad at decision making, it's that in certain circumstances, it's harder for them to think more broadly about what is it that they're about to do and the consequences. So with that, we've talked a lot. I want to kind of transition into the trauma piece. So I think really in parallel to the developmental approach to juvenile justice is also the trauma-informed approach within juvenile justice. And my guess is some of you have heard about this as well. I think I've been doing trauma work now for just over a decade. And in the very beginning, we would go around and our goal was just to get buy-in for people to recognize how important trauma was in the lives of youth who are involved in the juvenile justice system. The majority, if not all of youth in the juvenile justice system have been exposed to trauma. About 30 to 50% of them are experiencing traumatic stress symptoms, and about 25 to 30%, and sometimes and up to 50% for girls, actually can reach criteria for the diagnosis of PTSD. This is much higher than our veterans who are coming back from combat. So we really need, so that I think is, we've got that buy-in now. People recognize that trauma is important when we are talking about our justice-involved youth. But what we see that people in kind of at the local level, that jurisdictions are really struggling with, is what does that mean in practice? So I think kind of when we first started talking about evidence-based practices, people also struggle. Well, what does that mean? I think we're already doing that. Or they would say they're doing it, but they weren't really actually doing it. Now we're better at making sure they are. And also, people are required to use them by statute, and often in places. I think that we're starting to see that in the trauma world as well, is that some areas actually are required by statute to use trauma-informed practices. For instance, in Texas, they are required to provide trauma training to their probation officers. But then how does that trickle down into practice? Okay, let me give you an example in Los Angeles. Our Board of Supervisors somewhat recently eliminated the use of solitary confinement for youth in our juvenile justice systems. I would say that would be a trauma-informed approach, that it is not trauma-informed to be putting our youth in what we call the box in Los Angeles. However, what has happened now? Now the folks and the directors in our detention facilities feel like they have absolutely no tools in working with youth behavior when youth are acting out. And now they're seeing all these assaults and incident rates skyrocketing in our detention systems. So we have to be really careful when we have this well-meaning approach that it comes from this trauma-informed perspective, but it has this unintended consequence, because what they didn't think about doing is putting a practice into place or providing evidence-based trauma treatment to the youth or counselors to the youth. And so now you have these assaults actually increasing, even though they had this well-intended policy. I think, and then I just want to kind of one other big bucket, and then I'll pass it along. We've been talking about the criminalization of youth and the decriminalization of youth, and hopefully the pendulum is not swinging back, although I kind of feel like after today it is, unfortunately. But one of the things that I've been focused on lately is the commercial sexual exploitation of youth in Los Angeles. And fortunately in California, we no longer recognize juvenile prostitution as a crime, because we know that juveniles cannot be prostitutes. There's no such thing as a juvenile prostitute. Instead, our youth who are picked up for solicitation or exploitation, they're actually taken to our child welfare system. So again, I think that would be a trauma-focused policy and a decriminalization of youth, but we are still kind of struggling with now how do we work with the youth both in child welfare, and then of course they still end up in probation system as well. So that's kind of a huge bucket I'm just throwing out there, and that's something I've been focused on recently. So just if anybody is interested in that, I'd be happy to talk more about that too.
Thank you.
It goes a little all over the place.
Thank you. Pardon me. My name is Craig Schwalbe, and I'm an associate professor at Columbia University School of Social Work. I've been a social worker for a long time, and in my scholarly years, I have studied the things that probation officers do. So I've studied things like risk and needs assessment, casework practices, and counseling practices that probation officers use. And I want to give first some recognition to the first panel for introducing us to the discussion about the effect of inequality and discrimination, race and racism on the juvenile justice system and in our conversation, because everything that we've talked about to this point, including the things that I'm interested in studying, are infused with the effects of inequality and discrimination, and that's rooted in race and racism. So I recently conducted a study in Brooklyn, and it was with the probation department there. The probation department there is housed in the family court building, which is this 11-story monstrosity, really big, and you have to go through airport-like security to get in. And wow. I was in lines for a long time over the course of this study, and sometimes there'd be more than 100 people in line, and so I would keep myself occupied by counting people. And routinely, what I discovered was that if there were 100 people in line, I was one of 10 people who had what evidently was my skin tone. Everybody else was on appearance a person of color. And amazingly, maybe it's not amazingly, but not coincidentally, the final sample for the study that I've been working with in Brooklyn was identified themselves as 8% white and 70% African American, which is a huge overrepresentation for the population of Brooklyn. And this disparity infuses and infects everything that we're doing. One of the things that is a mark of our panel, I think, is that we're shifting. Our panel represents a shift in the conversation a little bit about how kids get into the system, how people come into the juvenile justice system, which ones get to come into the juvenile justice system versus being transferred to the adult criminal justice system. What's the floor, the bottom age, right? So our panel is thinking a little bit, helps us to think a little bit about what happens with kids once they're in the juvenile justice system. I mentioned that I study probation. And I'm one of not a lot of people who study this process. And if you're paying attention to the data, if you've explored the OJJDP websites, they've got this wonderful diagram that describes the pathways that kids take through the system. Turns out that like 60% of the kids who are adjudicated receive a disposition of probation. If you're going to talk about what happens to kids in the juvenile justice system, we need to talk about what happens in probation. And so I've settled myself there, and I've really appreciated Joe and others for the invitation to come here, because it gave me the opportunity to reflect a little bit on our topic, which is the relevance or role of developmental science in the experience of kids in the juvenile justice system. And so from my point of view, it's, how has developmental science influenced what happens in probation? And I think that it hasn't influenced a lot of what happens in the day-to-day activities of probation. Now, I have to say that I love studying probation, and I love probation officers. A day spent with a group of probation officers is a day well spent. On the average, in the main, this is a group of folks who've bought into, who represent and reflect the rehabilitative ideal of the juvenile justice system, as contrasted to probation officers who work in the criminal justice system, who are there much more to mete out punishments and monitoring. That said, it's a group of people who doesn't always know what to do to enact that rehabilitative ideal. So I have three things that I've been thinking about that touch on developmental science and that have implications for probation and other community-based interventions. Diversion, I think it has implications for diversion, community programming. Three things that have come to light in my work. I just wanted to share a nugget of them with you and then open the floor for questions. First is that as we understand the role of cognitive emotional control in adolescence and its gradual maturing process over the period of adolescence, we have to keep in mind the context of what probation looks like to see how might something like reward sensitivity, which is heightened, which is part of what causes peers to be very influential, right? That's right? Okay. So thanks. Hate to get things wrong when you're sitting right next to the developmental psychologist. So the context of probation is that kids usually come to the probation department. They might meet with a probation officer once a week or once a month or 3 times a week for about 15 minutes. And the probation officer checks in. There's a plan, a set of conditions that the probation officer encourages. There might be some rewards, tokens, things that they provide to them. And then the kids move into their routine lives where they sleep and where they eat and where they play with other kids, all outside of the control of the probation officer. The probation officer has very limited effects or limited touch with the day-to-day and moment-to-moment sets of contingencies that govern and that guide kids' behaviors. And so I think it's worth thinking about the implications of what that might be for probation and for kids who are involved in the justice system, who are not under custodial care. The second is that research that I'm participating in is starting to shine a light on the role of future expectations and possible selves on probation and on justice outcomes. So this is like what do you want to be in a year? And what are you doing? Or who do you want to be in a year? And then what are you doing now that is going to help you to become who you want to be in a year, or you, right? And kids have vary in their levels of development of these things called possible selves, or their identity beliefs about where they're headed into the future. And it turns out that kids who are successful on probation tend to have identity beliefs and possible selves that are that look like this. I want to succeed in some aspect of school. So there's something that is pro-social about their identity beliefs. And they're not too heavily weighed on, I want to stop getting into trouble, or I want to get off of probation. So these identity beliefs are important. But kids who are involved in the justice system tend to lack the kinds of social supports that lend themselves to the development of rich identity beliefs. So parents and others don't tend to have the same kind of conversations that probably my parents had with me when I was growing up about where I was headed. And so what is the implication for community-based services and for the relationship between probation officers and kids, and what probation officers talk about with kids? I think that is a question that we need to be thinking about, because recidivism is not the only thing for kids who are involved in the juvenile justice system. It's not the most important or the only outcome that we need to pay attention to, right? I mean, kids who come into the juvenile justice system have been exposed to an extraordinarily non-normative social experience, an interruption of their developmental pathways moving into adulthood. Now, we all understand why that happens, and we have the system in place for reasons. As a society, we need to do something. So I think that part of what we need to be contemplating with the juvenile justice system is how its processes can contribute to helping kids to get back on a developmental track, back onto a developmental pathway that leads to things like career involvement. And that takes me to the third developmental consideration that I'd like to raise for today, and that is vocational development. All of us, so many of us were asked when we were really little, what do you want to be when you grow up? Were you asked that question? I was asked that question. Some of us said we want to be police officers or firefighters, and others said, I don't know. But that's not an inconsequential question. Because by that question, starting when we're little and continuing in richer conversations during adolescence and young adulthood, we developed a career identity. And we developed attitudes towards our futures and an expectation about what kind of skills we needed. And we role modeled things. We had pretend play, or we watched people. And if we're going to help kids make the transition between juvenile justice involved kids, if we're going to help them make the transition between adolescence and young adulthood, then we need to pay attention to their vocational development or their career development. These are things that I don't think that there's a lot of work in probation or in juvenile justice generally about, but I would very much entertain a conversation about that with you. And with that, I will stop because
Craig,
now Joe's...
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Am I hearing correctly that neither the probation officers and, of course, the kids don't have problem-solving skills, that they're not teaching problem-solving skills, that the probation officers aren't working with the problem-solving approach?
That's a wonderful question, and it helps me to clarify. Probation officers, when you conduct research and talk to probation officers about their specific practices, you will see the seeds of problem-solving and teaching problem-solving approaches. But there's two things that conspire, at least two things that I think that conspire against a broad-based effect and effectiveness of their efforts. First, that their efforts, I'm going to say three things. First, their efforts are not systematic. So one of the hallmarks of an evidence-based practice is that it's systematic. And their efforts are ad hoc in many cases. Second, the context of the probation meeting itself can conspire against the effectiveness of those interventions. For example, probation meetings are very short. They're also in a context of monitoring, so monitoring for conditions. And then the third is what I brought to your attention in earlier in my remarks, which is that conversation which happens in the rarefied environment of the office. There's reason to believe that it does not necessarily translate and transfer into the regular, the day-to-day social context that adolescents are living in, when the contingencies that drive or the conditions that drive their choices are not necessarily in accord with the mandates of their probation officer or the efforts of their probation officer to teach them.
So what is the problem? Is it the people that are being chosen as probation officers? I mean, it seems to me we're just talking about common sense approaches here. Mm-hmm. Is it because they're ex-cops or they have... I just don't get it.
I think that's it. That also is a great question, and it digs back into our history. Now, I want to reiterate what I said very early. A day spent with a probation officer is a day well spent. But I think that we do have a workforce issue around probation. By and large, probation officers' prior education is in criminal justice, in schools of criminal justice, and that in and of itself is not a weakness, except to the extent that criminal justice, schools of criminology and criminal justice, the extent to which they actually train probation officers in the specific skills and models that they can carry into their practice. The next largest group of, I think around, I'm not remembering the specific percentage, it's more than half, well over half of probation officers are educated.
So is there a movement to like all of the movements we've been talking about all morning, is there a movement to bring probation officers into what, the 20th century?
I can't speak for what's happening in schools of criminal justice. I know that in my own profession of social work, there is more and more schools of social work are engaging with criminal and juvenile justice, and sending students out as interns with the expectation that they would take roles in justice agencies like probation. I know that probation departments themselves are partnering either on a local level or on a statewide level with institutions for the purposes of training and evidence-based approaches. So Faye Taxman at George Mason, for example, is somebody who I know who has large-scale initiatives.
Okay.
In that
So
area.
before I turn it over to the fellows, Carly, can you talk a little bit more about what's on the horizon in terms of biomedical approaches that might be more effective than what we're now doing, or anything in that area?
If you want. I'll give you just two quick answers to that. One is a lot of, you've heard the mention of cognitive behavioral therapy already. A lot of cognitive behavioral therapy has been turned over to things like cell phones. For example, if you just type in mindfulness and you see how many apps come up, we talk about mindfulness with juvenile justice populations all the time. How do you be more mindful? How do you be more skillful in just slowing down, thinking through things? There's thousands of apps out there. We are on the cusp of also using artificial intelligence. Facebook already does it to y'all, if y'all don't know that already. If you type anything that suggests suicide, which is the second leading killer of our youth in this country, you will get a notice from Facebook concerned about you. And it's not a person on the other end, it's a computer that has used its algorithm and said, based on the way you're discussing things, we're concerned and we hope that you will call for help in this. We're moving quickly into a world where AI can be more effective in monitoring what you're saying, what you're texting, what you're reviewing online, and be very interactive with you to get you towards help. And the problem we have right now is AI does not join that with a therapist on the other side. So right now it's just a computer giving you some hints, but if we can join that with a therapist that's working with you and has a case plan, that's a good thing. I don't know what's happening back there, but it looks serious.
Don't worry about it.
So then you've got, it's not just you and an AI, but it's you and your therapist saying, hey, by the way, I can't be with you every day and all this stuff, but based on your text, based on your discussion, we're concerned. One last thing about, again, cell phones and everything. There's studies coming out right now about cognitive behavioral treatment done with adolescents, where they create avatars. You want to talk about anonymity? You create an avatar, your therapist creates an avatar, and they're all skills-based groups. They're interactive, and the kids are responding very well to these. I'm not being taken away in some bizarre therapist office or whatever. I'm interacting in the world that I am very comfortable interacting with, and the turnaround is they're learning skills, and they're being able to demonstrate skills. So there's a lot more coming, and I think it's coming sooner than we would ever have anticipated.
Carl, can I go back to you in terms of trauma and talk a little bit about trauma and what's on the horizon in terms of better dealing with trauma, particularly with young people?
Yeah, so I think that I was alluding to the fact that, we spent a lot of time trying to get the buy-in, and I think people have buy-in now, but they don't know what to do. And for me, the next step is simply, are you assessing for traumatic stress? You don't need to be assessing for trauma. We know our youth are trauma exposed. But are you assessing for the functional impairments that are associated with trauma exposure? And if you are you then referring to evidence-based trauma treatments, which is, for the most part, not happening, right? So even in... You can ask, so someone will say, I'm trauma-informed. You say, okay, well, what is the prevalence of traumatic stress in the population that you work with? And they will not be able to answer you. And not to harp on LA at all, I don't know if there's any other LA folks, but like I said, I've been working with in sex trafficking, and even the child trafficking unit in both probation and the child welfare system does not use any standardized or systematic assessments for trauma exposure or traumatic stress.
So this gives you an indication of just how serious and unserious various governmental entities are at really dealing with this in a really informed, data-based way. Let me go back to you one more time, Philip, and talk a little bit about working with cops and how do you get through with them so that they understand that the punishment technique or the punishment approach is not the approach that works, and this is what works.
So two things. So and to keep this very brief, we spent a lot of time reminding cops about what it was when they were teenagers. The other thing is reminding cops that a lot of them come from the same neighborhoods that these kids come from, and the amount of trauma. And when we talk about hypervigilance, just really quickly, if you imagine when you've pulled your back or sprained something or broken something, it doesn't require anything to be done, but if you feel that sense that somebody's about to come and touch your back, you're already reacting, right? And they're coming from these same stress-induced trauma and type backgrounds, so their level of hypervigilance is already out the roof. Just making them more aware of that they react at a high degree, and helping them slow down so they can be aware of their own issues related to this. And then the other thing is empathy. And this is a tough one with cops, because when we talk empathy, and we do train empathy skills with probation officers and with police officers, it's effective, they get it, they do it, but it also puts them at the most risk. So we have to talk at a very real level. For you to empathize with that kid that is being belligerent, being angry, yelling, screaming, if you slow down your reaction time, you can put yourself at risk as well. So that's a thing that they have to juggle, and that's a tough juggle for a cop. My job is to go, a lot of cops believe their role is to get home at night alive. So trying to juggle that. I want to be empathic. I want to understand where this kid's really coming from, but there's a limit to that. It also causes, unfortunately, empathy causes burnout. And when you find really good cops that get it, they'll also tell you how hard it is to turn that off because they burn out. It's a lot of work to empathize with populations in severe need for a lot of help. So one of the things that helps with that is connecting to resources. So the biggest thing that we work with police officers is understanding what's available in their neighborhoods. And sometimes that's good news, sometimes it's horrible news, but the more resources they have to offer kids and families, the less likely they are to arrest. The cops want to do something, and if you can give them something that's not arrest, they'll do it, they'll use it. But you gotta be able to identify those.
I would imagine that de-escalation, which, for example, the LAPD has really applied to great effect, is very important with the youth that they're dealing with. Yeah. Okay. Questions, please.
Hi there, I'm Chelsea, and I'm a crime reporter at the Register Guard in Eugene, Oregon. You've spoken a little bit about impulse and risk-taking, and I'm wondering if any of you have done any research on juvenile sex offenders and also the probation component that comes along with that as far as having to register into adulthood.
So the only research I will give you, and it's important to note, especially with juvenile offenders, is when Louisiana was sued, and rightly so, for conditions of confinement. One of the things that we had to do is take over mental health care, including sex offender treatment, while we were doing that. There has not been a kid to date. I've been doing this for 25 years. I still haven't met a, quote, kid that's a, quote, sex offender that wasn't abused themselves. They didn't wake up one morning and decide to do this. So part of, especially when we're talking about kids, is looking at their own victimization that they have then, and wrongly so. I'm not arguing what they've done is correct to other people, but they've learned this because it's been done to them, and I still have yet. 25 years, I have not met a kid yet that wasn't raped themselves.
Go ahead. No, you're up.
Oh, yeah. Hi, my name's Art Levine. I'm Juvenile Justice Information Exchange, and I have a question for the health and behavioral health people. Two brief things. One, based on this book, Mental Health, Inc., and for Huffington Post, I want to ask you about the issue of overdrugging, because you, Stephen, referred to the promise of long-acting things, and HHS's Inspector General found that 92% of kids in the foster care and Medicaid system got antipsychotics for completely non-approved reasons, totally off-label, and only the child welfare systems in a few states have been sued by children's rights to stop them from giving over antipsychotics, but the detention arena is left untrammeled, as we just learned about the detention centers there. So how are you, in both your fields, addressing the issue of extreme overdiagnosis, extreme overmedication? That's one. Second, what are the evidence-based treatments for trauma that work, and how in the real world can people who want to do the good, right thing find a person who actually knows what they're doing and isn't just using the buzzword? Because that was a problem when I was interviewing trauma victims who had been abused in residential treatment. They were totally adrift, and no one had any idea. And lots of people are now using the buzzword trauma, and it's very hard, even if someone says they're doing evidence-based practice in trauma, which I don't know what they are, how to get a clinician who actually knows how to do it. So those are the two questions for both of you.
Excellent. I'll complicate that even more, that one size doesn't fit all evidence-based practice, and that's kind of the issue we're having, is where a door opens and somebody says they're doing, and they are legitimately doing evidence-based practice, everybody refers every kid to them, the judge refers everybody to them, and that's not how it works. They are behavioral specific in terms of what they can do and can't do. The pharmaceutical question, I'm going to try and answer it briefly. No doubt, we are overprescribing. Part of it is because it's too quick of an answer. People want to see behavior change quick, and you can do that. You can give kids pharmaceuticals and drug them into a stupor, and they will behave and act out less. That is absolutely correct. It is the wrong medical approach. What is happening is pharmaceuticals are trumping what we do know works, which is, the literature is very clear on this one. If you are going to give a child any kind of psychopharm drugs, that coupled with cognitive behavioral therapy increases the likelihood of positive outcomes. Drugs alone do not. They don't teach new skills. They just control acting out behavior. And actually, CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, has been shown on several occasions to outperform the psychopharmacology drugs that are out there. The issue being, how quick are you willing, or how much patience are you willing to exercise to let that happen? CBT doesn't happen overnight. You're talking about 14, 15, 16 sessions, 17 sessions over weeks with a child, while the parents, the school, everybody else is screaming, you've got to do something. Drugs have been a very quick and easy answer. And we need to get away from that. It can't be the quick and easy answer. And yes, kids are absolutely overprescribed for drugs that are off-label. And if you honestly get into the off-label, most of the drugs we use on kids are not FDA approved for actually adolescent behaviors.
And then I'll just speak to that as well. And so from the trauma perspective, what we often see when youth are diagnosed with something, it's oftentimes something like conduct disorder or oppositional defiant disorder or ADHD. And conduct disorder and oppositional defiant disorder are really behavioral-based diagnoses that really are not looking at the root of the problem. So one of the things that always frustrates me in juvenile justice is giving everybody anger management. Well, when you actually look at these youth trauma histories, they should be angry because really horrible things have happened to them and no one has been held accountable for that. So yeah, they're angry. It's not conduct disorder. They're experiencing PTSD and traumatic stress reactions. They're responding to what happened to them in their environment. And oftentimes youth who have experienced trauma are misdiagnosed because, again, not a lot of people are focused on traumatic stress when they're providing assessment within juvenile justice. ADHD was, super common, right? But what do you prescribe to youth with ADHD? You prescribe them an upper. Well, if you're actually experiencing hypervigilance and you're up all the time, that upper is going to just destroy you psychologically, right? So we're addressing these symptoms that are on the top without getting at the root of the behavior. And then in terms of, to your other question about evidence-based treatments for trauma, there's a number of websites that you can look at to see kind of where the gold standards are, like the California Evidence-Based Clearinghouse. The National Center for Child Traumatic Stress also has a list of evidence-based and promising practices. The kind of gold standard right now is a model called TFCBT. So it's trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. You can Google that on the MUSC, the Medical University of South Carolina's website. And it incorporates the cognitive behavioral therapy that we know works very well with youth, but with a focusing on psychoeducation around traumatic stress reactions, focusing on self-regulation, because traumatic stress is essentially dysregulation of emotions. There's a few others. Target, for example, I think it's moved beyond promising practice now, and that is a practice that can be used within juvenile facilities. The acronym is very long, but it's on those lists as well.
How do people on the ground find the clinicians who are trained in that and know how to do it, as opposed to the research that says this is effective?
Yeah, so for instance, I always talk about like probation, for instance. In LA, they're not actually providing any services. They're always referring out to services. So theoretically, our systems should be aware of the resources that are happening within the community. Even asking whether it's a trauma-informed evidence-based practice, people aren't even doing that, right? But then being able to identify it. There are some, you can ask them specific questions about which model they might use, or this is kind of going into the weeds a little bit. I can kind of talk to you offline maybe about some more specific ways to go about that. But one of the things kind of going back to the probation issue too, and that we see probably around the country, but definitely in LA, is that probation is referring to these services, but yet there's no accountability in actually making sure that they're accessing the services in the community. So oftentimes youth will get this laundry list of things that they should be doing, and we're talking about kids. Like, you got to go, and in LA especially, you got to go over here, over there, over here, over there every week. It's pretty much impossible, and so we're setting them up for failure. So again, if we are using systematic, standardized assessments that are truly assessing youth's needs, then we can accurately match them to the appropriate service. And we need to be better at tracking whether or not they're actually getting to those services.